Hi, Jess.
Hi, Ned.
So, Jess, today our assignment is a pretty big one. Today's episode is all about unlocking Chelsea Physic Garden's collections.
No mean feat.
Yeah, quite a daunting task given, spoiler alert, for a future episode, there are over 6,000 items in their collection.
And, we've never actually dived into the full origins of Chelsea Physic Garden.
Unwittingly, I think we've actually set ourselves up quite well to begin to get to grips with this huge collection.
Yeah, the raison d'etre of the organisation.
And its genesis.
How it all began. So welcome to the Chelsea Physic Garden podcast. Ned, do you know how old the Chelsea Physic Garden is?
Given that these episodes are deliberately being made to coincide with the 350th anniversary of the founding of the Chelsea Physic Garden, I'm going to hazard a wild guess and say roughly 350 years old.
You are bang on.
Can you give me a sense of what was going on in the world at that time?
Charles II was on the throne. European explorers had just got to the Mississippi, which, if you look at a map, isn't that far into America at all. France was fighting the Netherlands, so there was a lot going on.
Yeah, I mean, it's that moment just before modernity. This is pre-European preeminence across the world, but it's after the European conquest of the Americas. Or actually, as you said, if they only got to Mississippi, not even that, but of Latin America in particular, it's post that period. But at a point where things started being settled, science started becoming a little bit more grounded in reality and removed from pure alchemy.
Yes, it became less woo, shall we say, and more information and evidence-based, really. It was also around now that the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries decided to buy a little piece of land in a little provincial village called Chelsea from John Chain so that they had somewhere to moor their barges and have somewhere to grow their plants.
Do you know what the barges were for?
To move stuff around?
Kind of.
Transport stuff, I'm assuming?
Do you know what an apothecary was?
I mean, I do.
Do you know what a worshipful company was?
I don't.
Okay, good. 2 out of 3, but I could be smart-arsed about.
But I think the Worshipful Society of Apothecaries, which is a phrase we have come across so often, I never tire of it.
Yeah.
It's just the most beautiful juxtaposition of words and kind of...
Thinks of antiquity.
I think it's more of a delightful aroma.
Yeah. Much like many of the beautiful flowers in the Chelsea Physic Garden. And in fact, you can still see their coat of arms over Chelsea Physic Garden, despite them currently having no direct involvement with the garden itself. So an apothecary, as you know, is...
Well, someone who's involved in looking at plants and substances to make poultices and balms and...
Yeah.
Kind of an early chemist, I suppose.
Yeah, somewhere between an early chemist and an early doctor and a
healer,
magician.
Yeah.
And
it was an all-encompassing term.
Yeah, and this leads into the worshipful companies. So in London, there were guilds, and the guilds were called worshipful companies, and these still exist today. There is a company of the vintners, there is a company of grocers who traded spices, and who the apothecaries were originally part of. The apothecaries, as science developed, split off from the worshipful company of the grocers. The grocers weren't grocers. They traded spices and things that would have been used for medicine. So that's why they were originally tied together. Now, in the city of London, a lot of these companies still have their halls. They still have these enormous manor houses, essentially, that are tied to them. And because they had so much land in the city of London, they are still very, very wealthy. The Worshipful Company of Apothecaries was one of them. You were bang on with your barge. I'm just trying to be a smart ass as ever.
Well, what else would you use a barge for, Opening a small casino?
One other thing for the Lord Mayor's show.
Ah.
I'm not sure if you remember, in the previous Jubilee, you might remember there were loads of barges on the Thames.
Yes, that was a big deal. The flotilla.
The flotilla, which was awfully covered.
I know the phrase and everything.
So there was a flotilla every year for the Lord Mayor's show, and it was a big thing for these guilds to demonstrate they had the best barges. Now, the Worshipful Company of Apothecaries needed kind of a mooring. So they bought this land, this 4.5, 5 acres in Chelsea, in this distant village to London, and that's where they set up. Now, there's one other reason why it still exists the way it does, and we'll be covering a little bit more on this in the next episode, but that's because that land was bought in perpetuity by a very rich man called Sir Hans Sloane. He did this in 1722. He bought it with the Worshipful Company of Apothecaries at a point where things weren't so good for them and when their financial situation wasn't so good, essentially to ensure that this place of learning stayed as it was.
You would think that it would, there's so many just rare, precious plants there. When did it become open to the public?
So only 40 years ago.
I didn't know it was that recent.
It's so
I thought it was like a century at least.
Yeah, and it was still being used up until that point for these medical purposes.
Wow.
I only found that out yesterday. I just assumed that this has been somewhere people could visit for ages.
Yeah, like Shakespeare's Globe, or, you know, and I know the Globe was rebuilt, but I thought it was just one of those sites that people could visit. But actually, it's only in the last 40 years.
It was actually really controversial as well when it was in the 19th century, when London was unbelievably polluted, when there were the great stinks going on, which is when the Thames was so clogged with sewage that everyone had to shut the windows. People would die and fall out of... People were kind of said to fall out of Parliament, and Parliament was shut because of this great stench coming down the Thames. It was quite controversial that there were these green spaces in London called the lungs of London. So places like Regent's Park, Hyde Park, and Chelsea Physic Garden wasn't open to the public. And they said, look, this is a public health imperative that people are allowed to walk into green spaces. Yeah. And, you know, makes me think slightly today of the very controversial ULEZ stuff.
So all this talk of unlocking our collections, I think we should go and talk to the people who are there, who are creating the space, maintaining the space, and our experts.
Yeah, as much as I like the sound of each other's voices, I mean, our research can only take us so far.
Yeah.
And given we're talking about an organic, living museum, essentially, it seems slightly ridiculous that we're doing this in the safety of our studio. I will be going to my favourite spot in the garden, the Cool Fernery. And I'm not just saying Cool Fernery because I think it's cool, but Jess, I'm giving you the big job, the most important job. I'm being the Ken, you're being the Barbie.
Thank you.
You will be going to talk to Francis Sampaio about how this 350-year-old botanic garden is made an amazing visitor's experience for everyone who goes.
So I'm standing here with Francis. Francis, can you tell us a bit about your role in the garden, please?
Of course. So I'm Deputy Director of the garden. So I mainly look after our visitor touchpoints, so our visitors, our learners, and also our volunteers. And then everything that goes into making a safe visit and also a really fun and enjoyable visit for people. And a big part of that is communicating our stories.
So you're basically the interface between the public and the garden. You're the accessibility point.
I think that's probably a much better synopsis than I gave. Yeah, definitely.
Not at all. I just think that's such a fascinating role. What really strikes me is how it is such a working garden. It's not like this like beautifully manicured corner of London that remains pristine. There's always, I mean, even as we're doing this interview now, you know, there's always work being done, things being dug. It's so active. Do you find that balance tricky?
I think it works really well symbiotically. I'm used to working in places with really manicured gardens where everything is absolutely perfect. You can't look at a blade of glass without kind of getting a ruler out and making sure it's the right length. But here we're a lot more organic, and I think it's really special.
In the face of so much pressure, I suppose, to move with the times, how do you keep it authentic and true to its sort of origins as well?
Yeah, so we try and make sure that every learner has a great visitor experience and every visitor has a great learning experience. That's really how I sum it up, because we're still a learning space. And that's what we've really been for the past 350 years. So as long as someone comes to the garden and they have their curiosity sparked by something, then I feel like we're still achieving that original aim of the apothecaries to, educate people about plants.
We're asking everyone this. What is your favourite thing that you've uncovered in doing your job? Is there anything special to you?
Well, when I first joined the garden, I was really interested in women in horticulture. And I walked around the garden and I found the name of one woman. And that was it in this whole 4-acre site. So what's been really fantastic for me is that by uncovering our stories and by really investing in our interpretation and improving that, we've been able to, by the end of this year, 2023, we'll have 9 named women in the garden. And those are women from history, from today, and from all over the world in all sorts of different disciplines. And for me, that's so exciting to be able to uncover these stories and to get people to read them and feel inspired.
And I'm going to hazard a guess. Is that woman, that first woman that you went, okay, how did she do this? Is this Elizabeth Blackwell that we're talking about?
Elizabeth Blackwell is absolutely phenomenal. She's definitely near the top of that list.
Near the top, but not quite the top. Who's at the top of your list?
I have to say my boss, probably. They're on the list.
So Elizabeth Blackwell was that one named woman who kicked off this odyssey for you, and what a service to uncover all these subsequent women. But let's talk about this one woman who sparked your journey. When was she living? When was she with us?
So Elizabeth Blackwell was really active in the 1700s. And in around 1737, she published a work called A Curious Herbal, which was a collection of 500 different illustrations of plants and their medicinal use. And Elizabeth not only compiled all the illustrations, but also all of the scientific information about those plants. So she was really unique in not only being an artist, but also someone who was scientific and respected at that time, an incredibly one-off person.
And is that her link to the Chelsea Physic Garden, that document?
So she rented rooms on Swan Walk, which is just over the wall of the garden. And I like to think that she could probably sit up there and look over into the garden at all the horticulturalists at work. And she came here, and all of those 500 plants that she painted are from our collection.
Wow.
And because they're from our collection, she painted some real kind of, I want to say, she painted a lot of new plants that weren't really known in England. So things like tobacco, she was able to paint a tobacco specimen that was grown at the garden during that time, which not a lot of people would have seen or had access to.
And for some of these plants, is this the only record we have at all that they were in this garden at some point in history?
We have not done all the work yet to understand what plants were in the garden when. So this book provides us with the best starting point to actually understand what was in the collection. For example, because of this book, we know that avocado was grown in the garden all that time ago.
It didn't start in a hipster cafe in East London, guys.
But we still have an avocado tree growing today in the garden, and I've tried the avocado from it, and it is delicious. It would go great on toast. But Elizabeth Blackwell was able to paint that. So we know that tangible links through history because of her.
Do we know where she learned her skills of illustration, and also how she was allowed, in a way? I mean, it seems such a strange word to use now, but essentially, what was Mr. Blackwell doing at the time that this was allowed?
Yeah.
What was unique about her circumstances that facilitated this?
So Elizabeth Blackwell grew up in Aberdeen, and we don't have a kind of formal record of what training she received, but as a middle-class woman, she would have received some artistic training along with languages, reading, writing, and so on. She came to London with her husband, and he was a little bit of a, I don't know quite, a little bit of a troublemaker, shall we say.
Bit of a cad.
Bit of a cad. He started running a print shop, didn't have any training, got arrested. And so he's a whole other story. And Elizabeth said, actually, I need to support my family. I've got young children. I need to use my skills. What can I do that no one else has done? And there was no other herbal like this at that time. So that's where she got her inspiration for this project. There were some other female artists around that time, and women were typically only really allowed, I want to say, inverted commas, allowed to paint from the natural world.
I can imagine perhaps there was a sense of, oh, let the little lady paint her little flowers, when actually what she was providing was this incredible tome, this invaluable document. Is there anyone who springs to mind that we should know a bit more about, that you'd like to spread the word about, of these 9 women?
So I'm going to have to talk to you about Professor Mary Gibby, who is reached a bit of icon status in my heart. So Professor Mary Gibby is still an active botanist today. And in the 1980s, 1990s, she worked here at the garden to reclassify the whole Pelargonium genus. And she did this with a horticulturalist here called Virginia Nightingale, who loved pelargoniums and really expanded our collection that we had here. So that enabled Gibby to come and perform this scientific research. And I just love the idea of Gibby and Nightingale. Sounds a little bit like Cagney and Lacey. There's, definitely a children's book there, if not a TV show about them.
My actor brain is racing now, going, oh, would I be Gibby or Nightingale? And quite by chance, or perhaps by your design, Frances, we are now standing in the Pelargonium Glasshouses. You have a very special relationship with the Glasshouses, and something very exciting is underway. Can you tell us about that, please?
Yeah, of course. And I have to be completely honest, hands up, you've seen right through me. That's why we're here. So we're standing in the Glasshouses because we have spent the last 3 years renovating these glasshouses and really making sure that the collection can not only thrive, but also that people can see the collection in its most spectacular form. We've got over 1,000 plants in 7 glasshouses across the site, and we're getting ready to reopen them in September 2023.
Why do we need glasshouses for these plants?
A lot of the plants that grow within the glasshouses are, they need a warmer climate. They can't withstand frost, things like that. So that's why we need to grow them under cover. But because of the climate crisis, we're finding increasingly that some plants from places like the Canary Islands can grow outside and don't really need as much winter protection as we'd expect. So in the future, what we grow in the glasshouses and what we don't will change quite rapidly because of the climate crisis.
That's a very sobering thought. As joyous as it is that these glasshouses have been restored, there must have been a lot of pressure around this project, because the Chelsea Physic Garden has a very unique relationship with glasshouses.
Yeah, so the glasshouses that we're standing in are about 100 years old. So these aren't the first glasshouses that were on the site, but they have withstood the Blitz. They've seen the kind of end of the Victorian era. But going back to the beginning of glasshouses at Chelsea Physic Garden, we had the first heated glasshouse in the UK.
Wow.
Was here at Chelsea Physic Garden. And that enabled us to grow some of those plants that Elizabeth Blackwell got to see before everyone else did. The heated glasshouses were heated in different ways. Some of them were sunken into the ground, and that meant that the residual heat from the ground would help to heat them. Others had a really clever kind of piping of water around the glasshouses to keep them warm. And then, of course, the natural ability of the glass helps increase the temperature.
So all renewable, all sustainable. And this technology was there back then. That's astonishing.
They would use leather, they would use byproducts from the local leather industry to heat the boilers that would heat the glasshouses. So yeah, there is that idea of less waste and more renewable. But because we're a horticultural space, whenever anything goes out of date, we'll knock it down and put something up. So that's why those original glasshouses don't stand here anymore. But these glasshouses, being 100 years old, we thought it was really important to restore them. And we can't wait to get the public back in.
Oh yeah, they're magnificent. And as you know, this episode is called Unlocking Our Collections. What is the biggest secret that you have unlocked in all your research?
That's a very difficult question, but I have to say the story of how vanilla is pollinated is my favourite that I've discovered. So
do tell.
Vanilla is an orchid. So it's a flowering plant, and vanilla originates from kind of Central America, and it was used by the Aztecs and the indigenous communities in Central America. We know that. We knew that it was used as a flavoring. What happened in the colonial era was the plant was taken from Central America and moved to other places to be used as a cash crop, so something that could be intensively farmed and then profit could be made from it. What didn't move with the plant was the pollinator. So they had to discover how to pollinate the orchid so that it could grow the vanilla pod. And the secret to that was discovered by a 12-year-old boy. And not only was he a 12-year-old boy, but he was an enslaved boy, Edmund Albus. And he discovered how to hand pollinate the orchid using a twig or a blade of grass to move the pollen from flower to flower, enabling it to produce that fruit that turns into the vanilla pod. And that is my absolute favorite story of ingenuity and just amazing connection with the natural world, that someone was so observant at 12 years old that they were able to put this into practice.
That's astonishing. And very lastly, do you have a favourite little spot in the garden?
So I'm not someone that's very good at being still, which is probably reflected through my job. What I really love to do is actually come to the Pelargonium collection. And there are some...
Well, that's lucky.
Yeah, which is very lucky. And some of these plants we can handle, we can touch the leaves and they're scented. So I love just taking a moment and just seeing what pelargoniums are looking their best, and then touching the leaves and smelling the lemon pelargonium, the spice pelargonium, chocolate peppermint's also brilliant. And that's my favourite place to really just get away from it all and just have that connection with nature.
Frances, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us today. We are so grateful for your breadth of knowledge, your passion and the experience of walking through these gardens with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So I am in my favourite spot of the entire garden, the cool fernery. And I thought, given we're talking about unlocking our collections, I really want to learn a bit more about this space. The cool fernery, when it comes to a collection of plants, is in some ways one of the largest, I think, or certainly the one that you go into and it feels very cohesive. Maybe the pelargoniums. Now I know a bit more about that. But where does this big range of ferns come from? Were they ever a kind of a collector's item?
I mean, ferns have fascinated people forever. I mean, they are very unusual looking plants. And at first glance, if you come into here, it's all green. You might just kind of walk straight through and not really notice things. But when you look really closely, they have a huge diversity of their form. How do they actually look? Their fronds, which are basically their leaves. And then sometimes you turn over the fronds, you can see these things called sori. And they look completely different on different kinds of ferns. And so they have been collected for a long time, but definitely since the Victorian times.
Just looking around at the variety, some look like parsley, some look like, your classic ferns, and some are tropical with branches. You wouldn't necessarily think there were ferns, particularly the
stag's horn fern.
The stag's horn fern.
Yeah.
I was about to read its Latin title, so I'm glad you saved me there. Why were they a particular interest for the Victorians?
Well, I think because they were really accessible. Most of these plants grow in temperate regions, so in places like Northern Europe. And at that time, science became really important in the society in Northern Europe. Ferns grow everywhere. And so it was an accessible thing for people to go out and look at. And it wasn't just, your higher class men. It was also farmers. People were really into natural history at that time. They were just discovering all of these things. And also it was one of the few avenues that women could actually get involved in.
Interesting. Why do you think that was? Is it something to do with their life cycle, or something to do with their modest adornment.
Botany as a whole was seen as something that women could do. It was quite wholesome, and they were actually allowed, which I'm saying in inverted commas, allowed to go out on their own and look for these ferns.
What's your favourite fern in here?
Oh yeah, let's go and have a look. It's this stripy looking fern here.
Oh, wow, yeah.
And as you said before, you know, you wouldn't necessarily look at that and think it was a fern. I've got a developing love of variegated things. Lots of people don't really like variegated things, but I absolutely love them.
And variegated means?
It's kind of like got the kind of light colour and dark colour on a leaf.
I was thinking this almost looks a bit like a tiger stripe.
Yeah, it does. But it does grow naturally in the wild. So it's just really unusual. I actually bought this one time when I was at Great Dixter. And I was volunteering there, working on a cake stand at their plant fair. And this came into like the plant stand next door to me, and I immediately rushed over to buy it. And that is how like people collect plants. They share it around. You get planty people together, and they want to kind of share their knowledge and share their plants, and that's how everything gets moved around.
If I wanted to start collecting ferns, actually, how did the Victorians keep them alive when they were collecting them?
Back in the day, the Victorian days, they had just invented this thing called the Wardian case, and this chap called Nathaniel Bagshaw Ward developed this kind of like a mini glasshouse or a mini greenhouse. And he used it actually to get his, he was like into his butterflies, and it was to get them to...
Mate?
No, to kind of like pupate and to kind of, you know. And so he kind of put them in there into this enclosed environment. If you imagine during the Victorian times, pollution was rife, you know, the air was filthy. So it was kind of a way of protecting the plants from the pollution, but also kind of just giving them their own environment. And what he noticed was that things germinated from the soil that was underneath them. And then he got the idea, actually, this is quite a cool idea. I just kind of water in it once, shut it up, and then it kind of
self-propagates.
Yeah, exactly. It just kind of like keeps its own system going.
Wow.
So, but we don't need that these days. You just need somewhere that's cool and shady, usually, for your ferns. And most of these ones in here will grow outside quite happily. But what you do need is usually a lot of water.
And do you still need protection from pollution for a lot of these plants, or is it just not the issue it was?
No, pollution now, even though it's an issue for us in our cities and just generally, it's nowhere near as bad as it was in the Victorian times. And in fact, we can tell that right here in the Physic Garden, because we have had lichen surveys done from time to time. So in the 70s, certain lichen was very prominent in this garden. So the lichen that we had in this garden would only be present in very high pollution. So that was the 1970s. And now we don't find it in the garden. We have other lichens that prefer lower pollution.
So I don't necessarily need a Wardian case, but it may help.
You definitely don't need a Wardian case. And you're not going to get one anyway. So so what you need is a cool, shady part of your garden. And if it's dry, you're going to need to water them quite a lot.
Well, like most Londoners, I don't have a garden, so I'm just going to have to come back here. Thank you very much. So I feel I got the opportunity to unlock a lot of the information that I wanted to. Jess, it would be remiss of me not to ask if you've uncovered or unlocked any interesting stories, anything you find amazing about the garden you didn't know before.
Yes. Well, as I don't know if you're aware, but I did play a fictional doctor on television for a couple of years, Dr. Niamh Donahue. You watched every episode, didn't you, Ned?
You know, I used to watch it. I used to watch it.
Well, I mean, freelancers would certainly be familiar with daytime television. Let's be honest.
Yeah, I know. I loved every episode of the hit soap opera doctors.
It's actually a continuing drama. But anyway, don't make me give back my soap word. So, yes. But so, something really piqued my interest, which I had no idea of, right? Death Alley.
Yep.
What's so striking about Death Alley is you have all these poisonous plants alongside a bunch of plants that are not poisonous, but that totally resemble the poisonous ones, and they're growing side by side.
Yeah. The origin of that is the apothecaries, because the apothecaries needed to be able to tell very dangerous looking plants from plants which look very similar to them in the wild, to make sure that they wouldn't accidentally give somebody hemlock when they were trying to give them parsley.
That was part of their training, was to learn how to distinguish. So then you have that risky little game of putting them right beside each other.
Maintains so much of this original sense, even if the plants obviously aren't the same, even if all of London around it has changed, there is this pocket which manages to be quite modern and accessible, but also have this slightly mystic Old English sense.
It's such a strong connection to the past, and how extraordinary to think that these few little acres hold the significance, because what we've uncovered between the tea of it all and now this, the impact that this little patch of land has had on social and cultural developments, which is what we're talking about when we're unlocking the collection, bringing people in, helping them feel a connection to it. People like Elizabeth Blackwell and Elizabeth Garrett Anderson walked so we could run.
Well, thank you very much, Jess.
I'm so glad you enjoyed it. Thank you for listening to the Chelsea Physic Garden podcast. A special thanks to Francis Sampaio, Nell Jones and everyone at Chelsea Physic Garden. Thank you too to Pierre O'Reilly for our wonderful music.